Sorry if we're late. We had both Lady Foster and I had lift malfunctions of different kinds. Can I just say this, Lady Foster, before Ms Dobbin goes back to her questioning? You said something earlier that you're not the first person to say it, and I just wanted to make, this is not a point against you, it's just to make plain for everybody. You said something like the inquiry doesn't want me to hear, or you attributed basically to me as the inquiry, questions to Ms Dobbin. Can I just reassure you and explain to everybody, questions asked by counsel to the inquiry do not indicate any conclusions that I've formed or any views. They're really designed to test the evidence to enable me to reach conclusions. So I just wanted to reassure you that I haven't reached any conclusions as yet.
Thank you.
I'm grateful, Mandy. Baroness Foster, before the short adjournment, I was going to move to a different topic and to a different phase in the pandemic and look at what happened from autumn 2020 onwards. But before I do that, I just wanted to touch upon with you the attendance of the Deputy First Minister at the funeral of Mr Story. And I think it's clear from your witness statement that that was a matter which caused you personal difficulty and difficulty with in your relationship with her. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And I think that it's also right that for a period of some weeks thereafter, you didn't feel able to stand on a platform with her, so to speak, in order to give the press conferences that you had been giving previously. Yes?
Yes, that is correct, yes.
All right, and I think it's probably clear enough from your statement, and I hope I'm not mischaracterising it, but maybe a matter of personal hurt or difficulty to you.
Yes, I think that's a fair comment. At the beginning of June, the Deputy First Minister and I had actually given an interview to the Belfast Telegraph about how we were trying to work together after sometime bumpy start in terms of school closures, criticism of Minister Swan, and we were trying to work together through those difficulties. So it was a huge disappointment and indeed caused massive damage to the executive, to the credibility of the executive, to public messaging, was very hurtful to the so many people around Northern Ireland who had stuck by what were very stringent rules around funerals and wakes in particular, because, as I'm sure evidence has been given, my lady, around the culture in Northern Ireland to have wakes and to grieve together as neighbours. And all of that had been prohibited, and yet here was one of the people making the rules actually doing just that. So it was a huge disappointment. Personally, I felt very upset about it all, and I didn't feel there was any credibility in going back to press conferences at that time. The press conferences began again in September. I think at that stage, Michelle had acknowledged the hurt that had been caused, I think was the phrase that was used at that time, and in particular the damage to messaging. And given where we were then going, I felt it was important that we started to give those public messages again.
Yeah. And I think we can see, just picking up the chronology, that happened, and that you, when I say you moved on, that you did resume giving those press conferences together. And obviously the executive committee, we can see, fell into a rhythm of meeting because it had agreed a structure, hadn't it, by which it would remove restrictions.
Yes.
I think that framework, I'll bring it up, but that framework was put in place, I think, in May 2020.
Yes.
And I think the executive committee agreed some principles by which it would gradually remove restrictions, yes?
Yes.
And test the removal as well.
Yes, I think there was a matrix drawn up where, it might have been later actually, the matrix where we would look at the risk and benefit from removing regulations and the CMO and the Department of Health would have told us whether they thought it was a negative or a positive place. So we felt that that was a good way to look at the regulations.
And I think we can see that on their advice, there would be a restriction might be removed and then a period of time allowed to pass and then a decision taken whether or not to remove another restriction. I think that's
Yes.
broadly the process.
Yes, I think it was we would act and then we would pause and then we would see how that had an impact on principally the reproduction number, but also other issues as well, hospital admissions, capacity and things like that.
And I think we see in that document, I think there are a number of principles that were intended to guide your decision making. One of them, I think, was proportionality.
Yes.
One of them was keeping R below 1. So you had a framework around which to base your decisions, is that right?
Yes, we had a framework and also bearing in mind what the regulations themselves said, which was if a regulation is no longer required, then the Department of Health must remove that regulation. So there was a necessity issue as well, whether it was necessary to keep that regulation in place.
And I think we've established this with other witnesses. Baroness Foster, and I won't take you back to the materials, but it would appear that that process had worked for a period and that the R number actually went down by quite a bit in Northern Ireland in
Yes,
and around the summer of 2020.
In the summer, yes, but we did understand and we had been advised as well that there was a seasonal element to it as well in terms of the virus became more transmittable in winter rather than in the summer months.
And Baroness Foster, I'm hopefully going to cover the chronology without needing to take you to any documents, but if at any point you want to see a document, please say and I will take you to it.
Okay.
I think we can see, if we pick the chronology up on the 19th of August 2020, I think Minister Swan met with you and the CMO and the CSA. And at that stage, the R value was higher in Northern Ireland than the rest of the United Kingdom or the Republic of Ireland. Do you recollect that?
I do, yes.
And I think around that time, there were some concerns about whether or not to go down the enforcement route, that a decision was ultimately taken on the 10th of September to consider localised restrictions in some areas.
Yes, I think at that meeting in August, the Chief Medical Officer had indicated that there were enough regulations in place, it's just that they weren't being enforced properly, and that caused us some concern. Then in particular areas, actually some of them quite close to the Republic of Ireland border, there then became an exponential rise and there was a need to put restrictions in. And for the first time, we did it on a localised postcode basis. I think in England they had different tiers, whereas we had, for this particular point in time, postcodes.
I think, in fact, in terms of the areas, if we started, I think the first restrictions were introduced in and around 10th of September 2020. I think, in fact, Belfast was the main area of concern at around that time.
Yes, and then moved, I think, to Ballymena and to Derry and Strabane.
Yes, I think, again, just moving forward in time, I think by a week later, the transmission rates were still higher than the rest of the UK and the Republic of Ireland, and that the increases had been seen in Antrim and Newtonabbey. They seem to be recorded as the main concerns. Do you recollect that?
Yes, so there were changing areas. Some weeks, different district council areas were higher than in other weeks, so it was moving about.
And then on the 21st of September, you might recollect that SAGE then considered whether or not on a UK-wide basis, or certainly considered the position on a UK-wide basis, didn't it?
About short circuit breakers, is this the time that they talked about? Yes.
So on the 21st of September, SAGE had noted that incidence was increasing across the country in all age groups. Yes. And that the effect of opening schools at that time had yet to be seen in the transmission rates, correct?
Yes, indeed.
And it's right, isn't it, that SAGE proposed a menu of options that
Yes.
might be open across the United Kingdom for meeting the situation as it then was.
Yes, and I think the first of those was a short circuit breaker from memory, and then there were others of a lesser nature.
That's right. So advice to work from home, banning all contact within members of the household. So those kind of restrictions. And that day, on the 21st of September, the Health Minister, in fact, he requested an emergency meeting of the Executive Committee, didn't he?
He did.
And the decision, or what he put to ministers, was whether or not to extend the local restrictions on a Northern Ireland-wide basis. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And I think insofar as they were restrictions, they weren't a form of lockdown, were they? It was just that certain sectors
Yes.
weren't permitted to open.
Yes, I think that's right, including close contact services and hospitality from memory as well.
And, I don't think that, I'm not sure that's right, because I think that on the 23rd of September,
Right, okay.
pubs that didn't serve food were starting to open in Northern Ireland, that previously having been.
Right. Okay. I can't recall
No.
just the precise time. I just knew that we had moved to more restrictions on a... Yes, that's correct. So we hadn't put in... We had put in the restrictions at a postcode level, and then we followed those through right across the whole of Northern Ireland. And then later in October, we had the circuit breaker for 4 weeks.
Yes, that's right.
That's
so
correct.
I had really just wanted to set the scene, if I may, for, I think, the first document that it might assist us to look at, which is INQ 000 065 631. And I think this paper might assist in understanding how decision-making had changed in Northern Ireland. Baroness Foster, I don't know if you recollect it, but this kind of briefing was now coming before the Executive Committee in order to help inform their decision-making.
Yes, it had changed in terms of what I think Robin still was recommending what he believed was the right way forward. It was later on that he brought a menu of options, but I think he's still recommending at this point.
Well, I think if we, first of all, we look at paragraph 2, this sets out the reason why he was bringing this before the committee. Yes?
Yes.
So we can see that case numbers were going up. And we can see that, in fact, cases and hospital bed occupancy were increasing at a rate of 50% a week.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
And I think, again, what this was reflecting was that the effect of two things was awaited: the opening of pubs and the return of children to school. Yes?
Yes.
And I think that if we go forward again in time, and if we go, please, to INQ 000 304 274, please. This recorded a call with the CMO on the 30th of September. And this is a call with you and the Deputy First Minister. And I think that if we go, please, to page 2. The CMO sets out that the rate of risk was deeply concerning. And you can see that the CSA was setting out that the rate was above 2 over the weekend, yes? Mm-hmm. And again, I think if we follow this paper down, we can see that, first of all, I think the Deputy First Minister was asking whether or not it was being suggested that there should be measures for 2 weeks, yes?
Yes.
And I think if we followed this on down, the Chief Medical Officer was saying that the doubling time was 9 days and that time was not on our side. Yes?
Yes.
So that was the position on the 30th of September. And I think, again, if we can just pick up the chronology, and I think it's correct, Baroness Foster, just to put this in context, that I think that this is a period when the local restrictions are still on foot. Is that right?
Yes.
They hadn't fallen away. And if we could go, please, to INQ 000 304 331. This is now the 7th of October. And we can see that the Chief Scientific Officer was setting out that all of the indicators were getting worse. Cases in Northern Ireland were the highest in Europe for 14-day rates. He set out the position in respect of hospital admissions and setting out that it was thought that wave 1 admissions would be exceeded within a few weeks. Correct?
That's correct, yes.
And I think he was saying, it may have come down, that medical services were in danger of being overwhelmed at that stage. Yes?
Yes.
And setting out, thank you, that the death rate, I think, would go up in 2 to 3 weeks' time. And I think it's also right if we just follow this through to page 3. He set out where the R rate would be if schools were to open. So yes, we just see it on the 4th paragraph down, yes?
Yes.
So he was advising what the position would be if hospitality and schools were both open at the same time, I think. Is that right?
Yes, that was his modelling paper. He was always very clear that modelling wasn't a prediction when pushed about his modelling, but the modelling had taken in more information, certainly, than we had at the beginning of the pandemic, and we had our own Northern Ireland modelling, my lady, which we didn't have at the beginning of the pandemic either. And we had a strategic information group, so that's what that was all based on, yes.
So do you accept, Baroness Foster, that by this stage there is a good deal more sophisticated advice available to you about the R rate and, for example, about how it would impact on hospital admissions?
I do accept that that was the case, yes, my lady. Although at times when, and we will see this, when questions are asked about some of the granular details, we weren't able to get those answers, which I think was a frustration, particularly for some of my colleagues.
If we could move to the next document in the piece, please. It's INQ 000 276 520. So I think this will be familiar to you, Baroness Foster. It's a series of papers that were provided to the Executive Committee at around this time. Yes?
Yes.
And what the CSA, it appears, was doing was, again, looking at the R rate. Again, we can see it 4, considering the position in relation to schools. And I think if we just, again, scroll down, please, to paragraph 12, I think he sets out that the doubling time was 7 to 8 days. Again, the ceiling, I think, for hospital capacity would be reached within 10 to 14 days, yes?
Yes.
And that cases in those over the age of 60 had more than doubled. Correct?
Correct.
And I think that if we follow this on down, he sets out the position in relation to hospitals. So he set out, thank you, if we were just to scroll down, he effectively set out, didn't he, that there was already very considerable pressure on the hospital system. I think that this is the paper. I think it was said that hospital capacity, I think, was almost reaching 100% at this stage. Is that right?
Well, certainly hospital capacity was an issue in the first wave of the pandemic and was still an issue, very much so in the second wave. I think probably more so because we were dealing with the normal winter pressures as well. Our hospitals are always under pressure in the winter, but they certainly were severely under pressure at this time.
So I think, forgive me, if we could just scroll back up again. I think I went past it. We just... And just slightly up again, please. Sorry. Yes, that I had missed that on the table. So that table was the table that was setting out inpatients and admissions. I'm sorry, if we go back down again, please. He was also setting out the position in relation to critical care beds as well. So in this paper, he was effectively setting out the pressures that were already on the system without COVID-19 patients. And he also sets out in this paper why that had ramifications for community care as well. And then in relation to critical care beds, he also set out and explained the number of staff who it required in order to staff those beds and the extent to which it removed staff from other hospital wards as well. Yes?
Yes, I do recall a challenge, I don't know whether it was from me or somebody else, that why have we not more hospital beds ready at this juncture, and the answer given was that 15 intensive care beds extra would mean 100 staff, and there just wasn't the staff to deal with that sort of increase in beds. Because it was a frustration, I think, given that we knew we always had winter pressures, that there wasn't more capacity in the system in this particular year.
But Baroness Pfister, I think the point that was being made in this paper, and it's set out in the paragraphs that follow, I won't go through all of them, but what the CSA was setting out in this paper, wasn't he, was that interventions were needed.
Yes.
Because if there weren't interventions, hospitals wouldn't be able to do the work they were doing at that time and were at capacity doing. Correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So there wasn't any spare capacity in the system, and therefore, if the situation wasn't addressed, then the impact would be on ordinary hospital beds and the care being provided for people who didn't have COVID and who had other illnesses.
Yes.
And I think if we go, please, to the meeting of the 8th of October at INQ 00065756. I think that we can see that it's set out the impact that the transmission rates until that date were having on hospital beds. Do you agree?
Yes.
And if we please just scroll down. I think we can see, and I won't go to this, but I think that this was the point at which the chief scientific officer was accused, as it were, by one of the ministers of looking for a damaging approach. And it was being said that people weren't listening to the committee, not going where the problem exists and afraid to say what the problem was, correct?
Yes, I think that was right,
And
yes.
Was that a sort of veiled reference to the localities in which transmission rates were going up?
I think it was wider than that. I think, my lady, there was a concern that a lot of the transmission was happening at house parties, and that instead of looking at hospitality venues, we should be concentrating on enforcement in house parties. And I know that there was a reluctance from the police to intervene in the private sphere, and I understand that. But it was felt that there was a lot of drinking going on at home and house parties happening, and that was part of the problem that was occurring in terms of transmission in the community. People had a sense of relief in the summer, and that was continuing in terms of not complying with the newer restrictions and regulations, and part of that was fatigue. I'm sure a lot of people didn't feel that they were, my goodness, having to go back into lockdown again was not something that they considered. So I think there was a variety of reasons why that statement was made, not going to the source of the problem.
It is right, though, that this particular minister then did make a public statement, didn't he?
He did, yes.
Within a fairly short period of time, saying in terms that transmission rates were considerably higher in nationalist areas as compared to other areas. That's correct, isn't it?
That is correct, yes.
And as his leader, did you in any way seek to sanction him or stop him or speak to him about making those kinds of statements in public?
I think given what happened later on, you will see that Edwin is very much his own person in terms of his opinions. However, it's not a view I shared, and he knew it was not a view I shared, and indeed it wasn't a view shared by the other DUP ministers either.
I'm going to move on, if I may, in this document to page 16. And I think if it's just at the bottom of the page, Baroness Foster, we have the Chief Medical Officer setting out his advice. And we can see the refrain, the constant refrain, I think, that modelling wasn't a prediction.
Yes.
He referred, I think, in his advice to direct and indirect deaths. Yes?
Yes.
So I think that must have been a recognition in respect of the position in hospitals.
Yes.
Yes. And that he was never more concerned than he was then. Yes.
Yes, I think it was a reflection of COVID deaths and non-COVID deaths from not being able to access healthcare.
Yes, but it was also a reflection on the fact that hospitals were at capacity in Northern Ireland anyway, with people who had a range of illnesses other than COVID. Yes.
Yes.
And I think that after this, and again, if we could pick up the chronology, please, at INQ 000 439 242. He explained that, in fact, the situation in Northern Ireland was more serious than it had been in March.
Yes.
And did you accept at that time, Baroness Foster, that the situation had become very grave?
I did.
In
yes.
terms of the ability of hospitals in Northern Ireland to cope?
Yes, I did.
And in terms of the transmission rates as well?
Yes.
And it seems that the local restrictions that had been tried throughout September and up until the 10th of October may have had some impact, but they obviously weren't able to bring down the R rate in a way that would be required to meet the situation or meet the risk that then existed.
I think that the restrictions that were put in place were something that would have helped the R number, but unfortunately people weren't abiding by them in the same way as they had been in the first wave of the pandemic. And despite the fact that we were urging people to work with us and try to get the R number down, I think people were making their own decisions at this stage. And unfortunately, we reached the stage where we recognised that we would have to have a circuit breaker.
I'm just going to go to the last document that illustrates the position at around this time. If we could go, please, to INQ 000286275. And again, it's a meeting with you and the Deputy First Minister. And if we could scroll down, please, to page 2. And I think we can see it being said that hospital numbers and ICU beds were increasing significantly, that the point had been reached when routine surgeries were being turned down, and that a very hard intervention was sought. Yes?
Yes.
And in fact, he was seeking a 6-week lockdown, as he describes it there. Yes?
Yes, that's what he was seeking, yes.
And I think that if we scroll down, we can see that the Chief Medical Officer was saying that health services were 10 days away from being overwhelmed. That's the penultimate paragraph. On page 3, thank you. There's reference there to the doubling rate. I think we can see your concern. If we go into lockdown, businesses will close, suicide and other health concerns will skyrocket. And then the CMO advising in respect of that if Northern Ireland was a country, it obviously remained the position, numbers and trajectory are the worst in Europe. But implementation by the 16th of October is required. Yes?
Yes.
Do you agree that his advice couldn't really be clearer at that point as to what was needed?
Yes, he was very clear.
That it was a hard, and I think we've already seen from the Health Minister that a lengthier period of time than I think had originally been suggested. So I think at this point they're advising in and around 3 to 6 weeks. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, the Health Minister and his team were looking for a 6-week circuit breaker. I think I and colleagues felt, given everything else that was going on, particularly with people's livelihoods and their well-being, both physical and mental, that 6 weeks was a very long period of time. And the discussion then came into being around whether we could find a compromise position, and we were able to find a compromise position around 4 weeks.
Just before you get to that point, COBRA met on the 12th of October,
yes,
didn't it? And Northern Ireland, in fact, was mentioned because the rates were the high, amongst the highest. I think the only other place was Liverpool, maybe.
Yes, I think Derry and Strabane was the highest anywhere in the UK at that point.
And I think that this was also the date when it was announced that there would be an economic package as well, so as to fund any restrictions that were going to be brought about at that time. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
And again, I don't think that I need to take you to this, but a paper was put before the Executive Committee that set out that the data showed that rates were higher, significantly higher than in Wales, Scotland and England, and that the 14-day rate for Northern Ireland was the highest than any country in Europe, with the possible exception of the Czech Republic. Yes.
Yes.
And again, it was advised that there was a need for stronger intervention in Northern Ireland than in other countries. Correct?
Yes.
And in fact, in this paper, the CMO and the CSA recommended a circuit breaker to commence as soon as possible and lasting 3 to 6 weeks. So they, in fact, gave a window, didn't they?
Yes.
And in terms then of what the Executive Committee decided to do, I think it's right that the agreement was to close schools for a 2-week period.
Yes, I think that's right. SAGE at a UK level had indicated that schools could stay open, and in fact primary schools in particular had less transmission rates. I think the Minister of Education, there was a week's holiday, I think, coming up at half term in any event, and then he lengthened that by another week. So I think that was the 2 weeks
Yes.
that happened.
So really 1 week's additional school closures.
Yes.
And then in terms of other restrictions, there were some restrictions around bubbling, so to be limited to a maximum of 10 people.
Yes.
Close contact services, I think, were to close, apart from those that were related to essential health.
Yes.
Yes. But, for example, gyms were allowed to remain open. Yes.
Yes.
This may be, if it assists, I've checked to make sure what was
Yes. Yes.
brought in that place. So I'm not trying to test you,
No.
but I have checked. But I think perhaps most important of all, schools were to remain open once they came back from the half-term break.
Yes.
And in fact, the retail sector was also to stay open as well. Yes.
Yes.
So although this is being described as a circuit breaker, there were in fact aspects of society that were still open and available to people. Yes.
Yes, but if I recall correctly, my lady, there was quite strong messaging about not moving around and making sure that your travel was essential, even though we didn't have Regulation 5 at that point in place in terms of the travel exemptions. But I think we were trying to get people to stay at home as much as possible.
So that's right. There was advice given at this time that you should work from home unless you're unable to do so, and that no unnecessary travel should be undertaken.
Yes.
But that was advice as opposed to anything
Yes.
capable of enforcement. And again, in terms of what happened in respect of that, it remained the position, didn't it, that as the weeks wore on, those restrictions did have an impact,
Yes.
but they still weren't sufficient in order to meet the risks that still existed to the health service, correct?
Yes, that was the advice we were being given. Yes, that's correct.
And in the paper that came before the Executive Committee on the 9th of November, in fact, that continued to recommend that the closure of non-essential retail wasn't required. Do you recollect that?
No, I don't recollect that, but I'm content to take it.
I will. Well, I'm really happy to go to that and
Yes.
to demonstrate that. It's INQ 000 065 589. And I think it's at paragraph 25 on page 6.
Yes.
So that was not being recommended for the meeting of the 9th of November.
Yes.
and nor was it being recommended, for example, that schools should close either.
Yes,
Correct?
that's correct.
And I think that the headline is that the Executive Committee was advised that the restriction should be extended for a further 2 weeks. Correct?
That's correct, yes.
And if we please just go to the final document in respect before the 9th of November, and this is INQ 000276538. So the CSA was asked to model various contingencies or options open to the Executive Committee. So we can see the first one relates to services such as hairdressers. And he was asked to model that in line with, for example, if pubs and bars stayed open. Yes?
Yes.
And I think if we follow this on down, he sets out that it's just not possible to do that sort of modelling, correct?
Yes.
And that I think the best, I'm paraphrasing, but the best that he could do was to try and treat that as a package in order to try and, I think, inform your debate.
Yes.
Correct?
That's correct.
And if we go over the page to this, please, please. I think he sets out that under all of the scenarios that he had been asked to consider, that further intervention to prevent hospital capacity for being overwhelmed would be required at some point between the 1st and 15th of December. And again, if we just look at the point he makes at paragraph 9 as well.
Yes.
Hospital capacity is currently near 100% and has been exceeded on a number of recent days. It would only be possible to deal with an increased number of COVID admissions by downturning other services. This might lead to a greater number of deaths, which is difficult to model with any confidence. Yes.
Yes.
Baroness Foster, that was the position going into the meeting of the 9th of November, correct?
That's correct.
For your Executive Committee to consider whether or not to extend the restrictions by 2 weeks. When he gave evidence, Mr. Poots said, I think that it was the committee of your group of ministers had met beforehand and that it was you who gave the lead, that if there was to be a vote on the recommendation, and I assume he's talking about the 2-week recommendation, that it was you who was giving the lead, that the veto, as he described it in evidence, should be used.
Well, first of all, that meeting that he's referring to took place before the 10th of November, not the 9th of November. The context of the 9th of November is important, as with all things. Again, the Deputy First Minister had indicated on the politics show on the Sunday that we can't live in continual cycles of lockdown. She had indicated to me that she recognised low-paid workers in the close contact sector, like myself, probably had been lobbied by constituents about the issue, and a lot of young women in particular were finding it very difficult because of not having any pay if they didn't work. So she'd indicated to me that she was willing to look at the close contact sector. That changed during the course of the 9th of November, and it became clear that Sinn Féin were not going to support that. And in fact, we were going to roll on the restrictions for 2 more weeks without any recognition of the harms that were being affected against people in society. So before we came back on the 10th, we decided if they were going to push this instead of looking for consensus, because Deputy First Minister was in the chair, So she had the authority and agency, if you want to use that word, to ask for a vote as opposed to trying to find consensus. I was aware of that, and I felt it was a key decision and therefore should be recorded on a cross-community basis.
Can I just to check that I understand this? If we could go, please, to INQ 000356174, and it's page 53. This is redacted, but I think we need to go slightly further up. Oh yes, sorry, it's there. We can see that on the 9th of November at 6:24, Edwin called for a cross-community vote if needed.
Yes.
That's you, isn't it?
It is, yes.
So during the course of that meeting, would appear getting someone else, Mr. Putz, to call for the cross-community vote for you.
Yes. It's not the convention for either the First Minister or Deputy First Minister to call for a cross-community vote, so that's why another minister would call for it. And that is actually towards the end of the meeting, because I think, if I'm right, from memory, Diane had to go to do something in the chamber, in the Assembly. So I think that was coming towards the end of the meeting.
Yeah. So there's no doubt then, I think, Baroness Foster, that you were the instigator or the leader, as it were, of the use of the cross-community vote.
Yes,
at
that's
this
correct.
meeting.
Yes.
And in terms of the position that other ministers had taken, there is no doubt, is there, that the advice coming from the CMO and the CSA was quite clear, as we've seen, that health services in Northern Ireland were already under very considerable pressure.
Yes, but we had also taken the decision that we were going to balance the other needs, and indeed we had set up an enforcement group, which was then called an adherence group, I think, because we felt there wasn't enough enforcement of the regulations that were already in place. And that was backed up by the Chief Medical Officer as well. So we felt there was another way to deal with this issue rather than put more restrictions, particularly on low-paid workers who were trying to find a way through what was a very difficult period for them.
The CMO was quite clear in his advice, wasn't he, that a 2-week circuit breaker was needed?
He was clear in his advice, yes, but as I indicated, we had set up a mechanism whereby we wouldn't just look at the health advice, we would take into consideration other issues as well, and that's what we were trying to do.
And had the position not become too pressing, given the level, the capacity or the lack of capacity that had been left in health services for that kind of measure to be tested?
Well, the actual advice we were given in terms of the close contact services was that it would cause 0.05 to R, which we considered to be small enough on one side to allow people to go back to work on the other side. In other words, that the benefit was better for those people to be able to work during what turned out to be 1 week as a compromise in the end of the day.
And why, given the critical position that had been reached at this time, why press this matter to a cross-community vote, thus ensuring that you won the day?
Because we felt it was an important issue. It was a key issue as defined by the Belfast Agreement, and that's why it went to a cross-community vote.
Even though it removed Minister Long from the vote and effectively meant that the true cross-community group of ministers, if I may describe them as that, because they represented each of the other parties.
Well, that's the mechanism
Couldn't
that we have. I
make
mean,
a
it's a blunt tool.
recommendation.
There's no doubt about the fact that it is a blunt tool. And my lady, it's probably something that will be looked at in the future in terms of, do you move to weighted majorities as opposed to using the cross-community vote? But it's been there since the Belfast Agreement. It has at times been used by Sinn Féin, at times used by ourselves. It is the nature of the mandatory coalition here in Northern Ireland, and I know it's difficult to look at it in the context of the rest of the UK, but that's the way it is in terms of the mandatory coalition, to allow those who feel that the decision is going against them, that they can call for a vote on a cross-community basis. And I regret that the vote was put. I think it would have been much better if we had have worked through it and tried to find a consensus way forward, which is what we eventually did. But in order to get to that place, we had to use the cross-community mechanism, which is a blunt tool. I accept that.
Do you accept that it sectarianised effectively the most pressing and critical of issues going to the health and the life of people in Northern Ireland?
I don't accept that it sectarianises it, because it's a mechanism that's there since 1998 for key decisions. I think it was a key decision for a lot of people in Northern Ireland that we were going to take their livelihoods away again. I think that if we had have been able to move towards a more consensus position, I wasn't in the chair, Deputy First Minister was in the chair, it was pushed to a vote, and we ended up in a position where relationships almost broke down, frankly. And then we had to take some time out, try to come back together again, trying to find a way forward. And it was very difficult to watch from the outside, I'm sure. It was torturous inside. And I hope that we never get to a place where we have a 4-day meeting of the executive again.
You said that it didn't sectarianise the issues, but by taking Minister Long out of the equation, it had that effect, didn't it?
Yes, it did. And I think that's why I've said it is a blunt tool, and therefore maybe weighted majorities is something that should be looked at, particularly with the way the composition of the Northern Ireland Assembly now. Now, I'm not in it anymore, but it's the composition has changed, and therefore perhaps people would like to look at weighted majorities instead of cross-community vote mechanism.
The mechanism was used twice over the course of that meeting, wasn't it? And a number of people, and we saw what the CMO said about it, said that it didn't just mark a low point in the pandemic, but that it marked a low point, I think, in politics in Northern Ireland generally. Do you accept that?
Well, it was a low point in the pandemic. It was a low point. I mean, the lowest point for me was July, after the Bobby Story funeral. This was another low point in terms of relationships. But the mechanism is there. It has been used in the past, as I've said, on other issues which are not constitutional for Sinn Féin, such as welfare reform. So the mechanism has been used in the past. So whilst those who didn't want the mechanism used will, of course, complain about it, it is there to be used by a minority in a situation where they feel that they're not being listened to in order to reach consensus, and that's what happened.
And at no point did you think, we're in a minority here and we respect the views of our brother and sister ministers, and it's right and proper, given the seriousness of these issues, that we give way on this and see where we're at in 2 weeks' time?
I really regret that we couldn't find consensus and we were forced into that position. It certainly wasn't a good look for the executive, and I regret that it had to be used.
Because all that damage, and I should ask you first, do you accept that damage was done to public confidence?
Yes, I do.
By the use of the vote? And that damage was done in order to achieve, I think, a 1-week extension to the restrictions, correct?
Correct, which may not seem like much now, looking back, but at the time, it was a huge relief for many working in those close contact sectors and in the coffee shop sector as well.
But it was pointless, wasn't it? Because the advice that you had been given was that the 2-week extension was needed so that in order to try and avoid a restriction before Christmas. That was the advice that you were being given.
Well, in relation to close contacts, as I've indicated, that was indicated to be 0.05 in terms of R. And so we were trying to balance up that as opposed to the harm that was happening to people trying to make a living. And that's why the decision was taken.
In terms of what actually happened after that, it appears that there was a restriction, I think, for a week. The restrictions then lapsed from a period from the 19th of, it would appear from the 19th of November onwards, so that there was a week whenever non-essential retail and cafes were open. Mm-hmm. Do you agree?
Yes, I think that's right.
And we've heard evidence that even that week contributed to a 25% increase in cases that was seen shortly thereafter.
Well, at the meeting of the 19th of November, from the minutes, the Department of Health had indicated that the death rate was lower in Northern Ireland than in other nations. And he did, of course, say that there was very little capacity for any surge at all. But at that stage, we were looking towards a vaccine coming in December. And the hope was that R would continue to fall.
Yes, I think that the point at which the 25% increases was seen was on the 8th of December.
Yes.
So there was a week whenever some services and non-essential retail were open. But in fact, non-essential retail had always been open,
yes.
Hadn't it?
Yes.
Schools had always been open.
Yes.
And it appears that it was cafes that had been reopened in that week where
yes.
restrictions lapsed. And then it would appear that...
And the reason why that was the case was that we had said we were closing for 4 weeks, and a lot of the coffee shops had brought in stock to reopen on that week. And if we hadn't allowed them to open for that week, all of that stock would have been lost, which is why we felt it was important that they should be allowed to open for that short period of time.
And then I think that it's right that after that week, there's then a 2-week period of restrictions, correct?
Yes, I think that's right, yes, to the 11th of December, I think.
And then, and I confess it's extremely difficult to follow this through, that there then came a period after around, I think, the 13th of December, where those restrictions fell away, so that retail was open again.
Yes, I think that's right.
So, do you accept that in this period leading up to Christmas, that the position that's taken or the decisions reached resulted in a position that was almost incoherent in terms of restrictions being in place, lapsing, coming back in, lapsing just before the Christmas holiday?
No, I don't accept that they were incoherent, because we were communicating what was happening at that time, and people were waiting to hear, could they open their close contact hairdressers for a period of time, not just for the hairdressers, but frankly for a lot of ladies of a certain age who were feeling quite mentally unwell because they hadn't had their hair cut. And I mean, I know, my lady, you may find that strange, but for those of us who need to get their hair cut every couple of weeks, it was becoming a real issue, and we were being told this very keenly. So hairdressers, 0.05% of 0.05 in terms of hour, and the coffee shops were open for that week. And then they were closed again for the 2 weeks. The next couple of weeks was around allowing people to get ready for Christmas, to give them some hope, recognising that probably restrictions would come after Christmas again.
And I think the net position reached, and I think we can go to this at INQ 000 276571. And I think that we can pick this up from paragraph 3, that in fact, in terms of the modelling, that what it had estimated might happen in Northern Ireland was in fact borne out. Yes?
Yes. They're saying that the period before Christmas had led to that, yes.
Yes. And that led to the highest rates of infection, didn't it, in Northern Ireland during waves 1 and 2 of the pandemic?
Yes, but I don't recall, and I may be wrong about this, but I don't recall the Department of Health asking for restrictions during those weeks before Christmas.
Well, I'm focusing on what the executive committee did. We saw the advice that had been given.
Yes, but that was up until the end of November, and then there was those 2 weeks that we were advised, and we did that, those 2 weeks to close down, and then we opened it up again before Christmas. I don't think there was any pressure to close before Christmas. There was a discussion around Christmas, it started out, I think, across the UK, we were going to have 5 days for Christmas, and then that was reduced to 1 day at Christmas to allow people to come together in a bubble of 2 households, I think. And that was reduced so that we would try and deal with those issues. And then restrictions came in, as I understand it, on Boxing Day.
That's correct.
At 8 p.m.
I think that the point that the chief scientific advisor was making when he came to give evidence was that what happened in Northern Ireland, that it had its highest death rates and highest infection rates were as had been estimated and bore out what the executive committee had been advised of in the weeks leading up to Christmas.
Yes, but I do make the point that we weren't advised to close down before Christmas in those 2 weeks beforehand.
And I think what we also saw, and we took the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to this, was that in fact capacity within the health services were so affected by staff absences at this point in Northern Ireland that military aid had to be provided to Northern Ireland in order to compensate for all of the healthcare staff who were off work.
Yes.
Baroness Foster, just one point. I think that it has been accepted by a number of ministers who have given evidence in the inquiry, and I think you foreshadow it in your witness statement, that insufficient account was taken and insufficient account was paid to the most vulnerable people in Northern Ireland and what the impact of lockdowns would be on them. Do you accept that?
Yes, absolutely.
My lady, those are my questions. I understand my learned friends have some.
Would you prefer to have a break? We wouldn't normally break till 3. We've got about 20 minutes or so of questions. You happy to go on?
No, that's fine, yes.
Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, Milady, and Baroness Foster. Baroness Foster, can I take you back, please, to some evidence you gave at the start of your evidence this morning? And it's in relation to the Department of Health being the lead department in
Yes.
relation to the pandemic, and you'll recall that section of your evidence with Ms Dobbin. The inference, or perhaps the evidence, being that in January and February 2020, you, as the First Minister, were not directly involved in the pandemic response in this jurisdiction.
Not involved directly in the pandemic response. I think that's fair.
Yes.
Yes.
So I assume, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume you have listened to the evidence of Minister Swan and First Minister Ms O'Neill.
Not all of it, but
Okay.
I've heard most of it, I would like
Thank
to
you. Well, it perhaps doesn't matter greatly, but they were both asked about their recollection of exercise Nimbus, which we know to be the UK government's exercise
Yes.
in pandemic preparedness, which took place on the 12th of February 2020.
Yes.
And I think you may have been asked at our request to look at a few documents in
Yes.
relation to that overnight.
I have.
Well, I wonder if we can have a look at the first one, please. It's INQ 000 469510. And if we can go to the second page, please. And just zoom in on the second page. Thank you. So we can see here that whoever has forwarded it from the Permanent Secretary's account in the TEO email account has indicated that this was not sent to the Department of Health Minister. It's to take place on the 12th of February at 4:45 in the evening. We can see it's a COBRA meeting. And it says underneath it, this is an invitation for your Secretary of State and First Ministers to attend a top table exercise on the coronavirus response. Okay? So the first point is that this wasn't, if you like, an either or Department of Health or First Ministers.
Yes.
You were, Ms O'Neill was, and Mr Swan was
Yes.
invited. And I dare say the invitation may have been extended further had there been such a request. But at the very basic level, those were the invitations that were sent out, and you agree with that?
Yes.
Now, we can see underneath what the nature of the exercise is. The aim is to rehearse ministerial level decision making for UK pandemic preparedness and response within this novel coronavirus outbreak. The objectives are to expose the potential scale and range of impacts arising from the pandemic, to identify the likely type and range of decisions that would need to be taken, and to rehearse the structure, process and protocols for supporting critical and strategic decision making in response to the approaching pandemic. Okay? Now, this was sent, if we can just zoom out, please, because I think this email is dated at the top, the 6th of February. And we know that on the 30th of January, a civil servant called Bernie Rooney had drafted that 30th of January document that you're not quite sure ever landed on your desk, but you're
Yes.
familiar broadly with the contents of. And we also know that at the executive meeting on the 3rd of February, COVID was on the agenda.
Yes. Under any other business, yes.
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 Did the terms of this invitation to you and the Department of Health and the Minister of Health not trigger your interest in terms of attending?
Well, there was a couple of things. First of all, the other devolved administrations were sending their health ministers to the event. Robin had led in COBRA on these issues for us. And the third thing, which probably shouldn't come into the decision making, but I think probably did come into the decision making, was that we as an executive were having an away day, in inverted commas, on the 12th of February to plan our programme for government and budget. In the minutes of the executive meeting before the 12th of February, Robin has said, I have to go to a COBRA meeting in the late afternoon, so I might have to leave the planning meeting early. So he, at that stage, was committed to going to this meeting. So I'm sure that probably played a part in the decision making as well, the fact that we had an away day planned for programme for government and budget preparation. And as I said, because he was leading on the issues for us with COBRA at that time, I felt he was the most appropriate minister to go.
The away day was really to identify the most pressing issues for governance with our new assembly.
It was actually to try and see where we were going with our programme for government.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it started at about 9 o'clock in the morning and
Yes.
finished, we know, about 3:30.
Yes.
And in fact, the Minister for Health dialed into this meeting, and
Yes.
you know that because you've seen it. So the away day in and of itself didn't impact your attendance. You could have done both.
I could have done both, but I didn't know that at the time of the invitation coming in.
Well, it says 16:45.
Yes, it said that for that, but we didn't know how long the other meeting was going to run on for, which is why Minister Swan had said, look, I might need to leave the other meeting to go to this meeting.
Did he need to leave?
No, because he had, because the meeting had finished. No, he didn't need to leave early.
Did you ask him at the end of the away day? I understand you're going to that COBRA, and it seems to be a significant one. Would you please report back to me and tell me, and to us, and tell us what happened?
Yes, well, he did report back because he did update the executive meeting at the next executive, again under any other business, around the COBRA meeting and the planning of that time.
Well, you also mentioned that the other devolved administrations were sending their health ministers. The situation for the other devolved administrations is, of course, different. They don't have the same departmental structure that you have to work with in this jurisdiction.
Yes, that's correct.
With the Minister for Health having sole responsibility over his department.
That's correct.
You see, if we can look, please, at the outcomes of the minutes of exercise Nimbus, it's at INQ 000195891. And if we can go to, please, I think it's the paragraph 16, which we'll have to scroll down, perhaps to the second or third page. Thank you, fourth page. Paragraph 16, if we can zoom in from 16 perhaps to 26, or, well, this is fine for now. The contribution, according to the minutes from a Northern Irish perspective, and we can see it at 16, the Northern Ireland Executive highlighted that they had a lag in available staff. As a result, community, social and primary care services were struggling. They had an eye on oxygen supplies as they only, bearing in mind this is the 12th of February, had 4 days left, but the logistical supply chain was a concern as all supplies came through the Republic of Ireland. Did you know that in mid-February, that there were only 4 days left of oxygen?
No, but I do recall a meeting of the executive a short time after that where it became public knowledge, and I think there'd been a media report in Altnagelvin Hospital. When we asked the minister about it, he said no, that they had enough oxygen and they were content. They had their supplies, but I didn't know about it at that juncture, no.
It would have been important, do you agree?
Yes, it would have been important, yes.
We can see, following down the page here, that attending this meeting from an English perspective at the very least,
Yes.
were the Minister for Housing, Communities and Local Government, the Treasury, the Department for Work and Pensions, the Department for Transport, the Home Office, and essentially a wide range
Yes.
of cabinet-level ministers or their representatives. Do you accept, looking at what took place and looking at who attended, that there plainly was a need for cross-government attendance at this meeting on the 12th of February, or at least it would have benefited had there been, from our perspective?
Yes, I think it's fair to say, my lady, that looking at this now, both myself and the Deputy First Minister should have been at this meeting along with the Department of Health.
See, we saw from the email that I put on screen, and I won't go back to it, that I think a Permanent Secretary replies that you're keen for the Minister for Health to continue leading on this or to attend on your behalf. And a short time thereafter, there's a reply saying the DFM is in agreement with you. Was there ever any discussion between you and the Deputy First Minister about the potential importance of attending this?
No, I don't think there was any discussion around it. As I say, had thought wrongly that this was a health meeting. What happens ordinarily is that invitations are brought through the special advisors who would say, this has come in. They would say, I think health should go to that, and I'm not moving away from any. It was my decision to say that health could look after it, but I'm trying to explain why I came to that decision, because they were leading on this issue at that point in time. I fully accept that we should have been at that meeting, and it would have been actually very helpful for us if we had been at that meeting.
See, this morning you told us about this period of time that throughout it really you looked to the Department of Health for information.
Yes.
To use your words, this is not a passing of the buck. You just didn't have the information.
Yes.
But is there an alternative way of looking at that, Baroness Foster? You didn't have the information because you did pass the buck to the Department of Health?
No, I don't think that's a fair assessment of what was going on at that time. As I said, we had other pressures. I fully accept that it turned out that this was the most pressing pressure, and therefore we should have been at this meeting. I fully accept that. But at the time, we had other issues that were pressing us for our attention. And that's what happened, I'm afraid, my lady.
I'll move on to a new topic, and you touched on it briefly this afternoon. Can we have your statement INQ 000418976 at paragraph 233? Please, it's your 28th of February statement, Baroness Foster. And it's dealing with the statement by your colleague, Mr. Poots, in relation to transmission rates across different areas. I might zoom in, please, on paragraph 233. You say, I'm also aware that it has been suggested that a minister indicated that rates of transmission were higher in nationalist areas as compared to unionist areas. While I don't recognise this as being accurate, I don't consider it would have had a huge impact on public confidence. If we might just break that down, it's not that you're aware that it has been suggested. You knew at the time, in and around the 19th of October 2020, that your colleague had made a suggestion.
Yes.
So it's not a suggestion that you have realised after the event. You knew about it at the time. Isn't that right?
Well, I
think
didn't.
Ms Gamble, forgive me, I think you may have misread.
Have I?
Are you suggesting that Lady Foster was saying she didn't recognise the suggestion that a minister had indicated higher transmission rates?
No, I'm suggesting that she knows as a fact that it did happen.
Oh, I see, as opposed to it's been suggested.
It's been
I follow.
suggested to
Thank
me.
you.
Yes. So you
Yes.
knew at the time, as a fact, that statement was
At the
made.
time, I certainly had no prior knowledge that I
No,
was going to say.
I don't suggest for a moment that you did. But you also knew, well, you've told us today, it wasn't a view that you shared.
No.
And so far as you knew, it was an entirely baseless view. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree with that.
So we've got the fact that it happened, the fact that you knew it was baseless, and it's also a statement that was put out publicly at what was a very difficult time for our communities in the north, because we were 3 days into this circuit breaker that was difficult for everyone across the board. You'll agree with that, don't you?
I do, yes, absolutely.
Why did you not do anything about it publicly, given the importance to you, Baroness Foster, of maintaining public confidence?
Because I didn't want to give it any more traction than it already had. And if I had have entered into the sphere to slap Edwin down for what was clearly not accurate, it would have become a huge media story, intra-DUP story. And frankly, I thought it was better to let it pass. And if I had have been asked about it, I would have said absolutely, I don't agree with it. But the reality is, he'd made the statement, and I was trying to minimise any impact that it had on public confidence.
Well, one can understand that as a way of dealing with things publicly, is to not give it any further oxygen. Another way of dealing with it is a public statement by you and the Deputy First Minister, the then Deputy First Minister, saying, united, we disapprove, we disavow that statement, we are all in this together. Was that an option?
I spent many hours trying to keep everybody in this together, including when the Deputy First Minister went off and attacked other ministers and tried to get everybody to keep in the tent and work together. It was, my lady, torturous at times to try and keep everybody on the same page, because we're all very strong personalities. I think the inquiry has seen that from evidence that has been given. And I thought, perhaps wrongly, Ms Campbell, that that was the best way to deal with it, to try and not give it oxygen and to move on.
Did you consider that approach when dealing with the aftermath of the Bobby Story funeral?
Well, the aftermath of the Bobby Story funeral was in a completely different league in terms
I don't suggest they were in the same league, but did you consider, in the aftermath of the Bobby Story funeral, managing things publicly in a way that would minimise damage, that would make sure the Bobby Story funeral did not continue a trail or pass a trail over future decisions that the executive had to make?
Well, actually, Ms Campbell, I could have, and some people were pressing me to use the nuclear button at that point in terms of the executive, and I felt that that was absolutely not the thing to do in the middle of a pandemic, and that I had to stay and try and work through the difficulties that had arisen. I know there are some in my community who were wondering why I hadn't called for the Deputy First Minister to resign, and I didn't at that time. I asked her to reflect and apologise, and I'm very glad that she has used the inquiry as a place to apologise. I think that that is the right thing to do, and I'm pleased that that has happened. But be under no illusion, my lady, that that was a moment of maximum risk, and I had to try and manage internally my own colleagues and externally as well.
My lady, I appreciate I'm pushing time. I wonder if I can deal with one more topic.
One more topic, then we've got Mr
Thank you.
Freedman,
Yes.
and because the stenographer's going to walk out.
Yes, no, I'm grateful to our stenographer as well. I want to please, in that case, Baroness Foster, have a look, please, at some comments that you made in the middle of the discussions about the cross-community vote.
Sure.
And it's at INQ, INQ 000 116294. This is a handwritten note of the meeting, and it's at page 95. And just while that's coming up, when we were dealing with this earlier this morning, you made clear that under the ministerial code, there was a duty upon those present to try and reach consensus.
On the chair to try and reach consensus.
Well, and all of those present surely had a duty to try and assist her in that task.
Yes, principally the chair needs to try and find ways to find consensus.
If we can, could we go just to the bottom of page 94, because it spans these two pages. You can see that there is a note attributed to you, the First Minister. We can see at the very top of the page. And you talk about the executive to reach consensus vote, and we talk about the ministerial code. Where have we breached? And then down the page, only COVID deaths matter to the SDLP. All deaths matter to me.
Yes.
Is that something that you might have said to Minister Mallon in a meeting where we're trying to reach consensus?
Yes, well, I think you have to understand that Minister Mallon was essentially accusing me of causing deaths in the community at that point in time by not having a full lockdown, and I reject that completely. And I was concerned about all of the deaths that were occurring in Northern Ireland, particularly those deaths that were occurring because people weren't able to access healthcare for physical ailments or indeed for mental health ailments as a result of restrictions that have been put in place, not just in hospitals, but also in general practitioners. And therefore, I was making the point that all deaths that were occurring right across Northern Ireland were of concern to me.
My lady, I'm out of time, unfortunately, but thank you. Thank you.
Just a bit over. Mr Freedman.
Baroness. Good afternoon. I ask questions on behalf of Disability Action Northern Ireland. Ms Dobbin has already asked you about your several reflections in your statement that we needn't go to, that in effect insufficient account was taken and insufficient account was paid
Yes.
to socially vulnerable groups about the impact of the non-pharmaceutical interventions. On that, the inquiry has heard similar insight from Karen Pearson, Jenny Piper, Deirdre Hargey, Robin Swan, and yesterday Michelle O'Neill, that there was insufficient engagement with disabled groups during the pandemic in that respect. Do you agree with them?
Yes, I don't think there was enough engagement, and I think that this is very much a learning point for any future emergencies, that we do engage immediately with those groups representative of vulnerable people, whether that's people with special needs, whether it's disabled people, those suffering from domestic violence. There's a whole list of vulnerable groups that we didn't engage with before the lockdown happened, and I regret that.
May I then ask you, as a previous First Minister, a person who knows this place, cares about it,
Yes.
the same question that I asked the current First Minister. What is your lesson learned about why politicians in this jurisdiction, who are otherwise deeply engaged in their communities, have not been as equally engaged with disabled ones?
Well, I think we were engaged because we don't live separate from the communities, I'm sure you accept.
Yes.
We live in the communities,
Very much so.
and therefore those of us who were close to people who had particular characteristics knew very well the impact that lockdown was having. And you will note that quite early on, and I was criticised for this, my lady, I had a number of people coming to me and saying, we cannot access the graves of our loved ones. We cannot go to those graves because the gates are closed and you have banned us from going to graveyards. We can go out for a walk, but we can't go to a graveyard. And I thought that was incredibly cruel. And we did react to that and change that. And some people said, well, why are you changing that? But I was reflecting on the fact that those regulations should only stay in place for as long as necessary and if they were proportionate. And again, if people brought us particular circumstances, and I accept that this is not a strategic way to act, I totally accept that. Mm-hmm. But if people brought us particular circumstances that were causing concern and harm, we would try and deal with that in the process. And I regret that we didn't do enough at the start of the process to deal with those issues. But I think, as the Deputy First Minister, now First Minister, said yesterday, it certainly is something that will be on the agenda moving forward.
So just lastly on that, there's all the opportunity for that face-to-face interaction at the grassroots.
Yes.
But you're accepting it needs to be more strategic.
I do.
And it needs to be more structured engagement with organisations like Disability Action.
I do.
Is that correct?
I accept that.
Thank you, and thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Friedman. Thank you very much for your help, Lady Foster. I do understand the burdens we place. You've now helped the inquiry twice, as of course has the current First Minister, so I'm very grateful to you for your help.
Thank you very much.
I shall return at 3:30. I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long, Mr. Todd. Mr. Scott.
My lady, may we call Alan Todd?
If you'd like to stand up and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Todd.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for your assistance to the inquiry. You provided the inquiry with a witness statement dated 31st of October 2023. That's up on screen. And at page 22 is your signature and the statement of truth. Can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
That's correct.
And you're content for that to be relied on for the purposes of the inquiry?
I am.
If I can just quickly go over your background. So you were appointed to the rank of Assistant Chief Constable in the Police Service of Northern Ireland in 2016, a position that you held until July 2023 when you retired.
That's correct.
And you've got more than 30 years' experience as a police officer prior to your retirement, and you've been decorated with the King's Police Medal for Distinguished Service.
That's correct.
And in your role as Assistant Chief Constable, you were responsible for local policing within Northern Ireland, and in particular in relation to the pandemic, you were responsible for all aspects of the police response to Covid-19.
That's correct.
Just want to briefly outline the Police Service of Northern Ireland. It's correct that it's a single police service. It's got responsibility for policing the whole of Northern Ireland.
That's correct.
And it has about 6,600 police officers and 2,300 police staff. In terms of staff size and territorial scope, how does the PSNI compare to other police services across the UK?
PSNI is one of the larger services in the United Kingdom, and that reflects the fact that as a unitary police service, we are standalone and self-sufficient in many functions that would otherwise be shared in the rest of the United Kingdom. But there's also a piece of the strength of the organisation has its history with the conflict in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the various requirements have arisen over time from that. Of course, the patent report would have recommended a service in similar circumstances to be 7,500 officers. It's now substantially less than that, but that's the background, my lady.
Thank you. And there are two broad oversight bodies. So you have the Department of Justice, which provides for the governance of the PSNI, is that correct? But it doesn't have any operational oversight of the PSNI?
In common with other police services across the UK, it's generally regarded policing as what's known as operationally independent,
yes,
and operates within a triple lock, generally at ministerial level on one side and oversight body being the policing board on the other.
And you do have the policing board, and that has the effective oversight of the delivery of the policing service. Is
That's
that right?
correct.
And I just want to touch upon the relationship between PSNI and the National Police Chiefs Council,
yes,
the NPCC. So you say in your statement that the role of the NPCC in relation to the PSNI during the pandemic was coordinating a representative in that it acted as a conduit for information sharing between forces. But the NPCC played no role in the enforcement of COVID-19 regulations in Northern Ireland, and it has no operational directive powers in relation to PSNI or any individual officer. That encapsulates the relationship the PSNI had?
It does. Having said that, we do regularly rely on NPCC structures across a whole range of policing disciplines: public order, public safety policing, firearms policing, national standards. Anything involves a national standard, we would strongly rely on the research, the best practice that arises and disseminated through NPCC.
And there was a national standard in relation to the response to the pandemic in terms of Operation Taller, is that
There
right?
was indeed, yes.
Would you be able to provide, I know my lady's heard this a number of times, but would you be able to briefly
Tell me,
describe?
4 E's coming up?
Indeed. And I know you've been given several versions of that, my lady, over the time. But it was engage, encourage. I always forget them myself, actually, sometimes. It was to engage with the members of the public in the first instance, to explain the regulations to them, to encourage their participation and adherence to those. And if that was unsuccessful and it was deemed to be proportionate, then to move to the fourth E, which is enforcement. So you'll see in police documentation, you'll see in my pieces from time to time talking to staff, sometimes we talk about the 3 E's and then the fourth E for that very reason.
Can you speak a little more slowly, Mr. Todd?
Certainly.
It's all right, we've been pressing the stenographer,
I
putting
understand.
pressure on all day. So.
Apologise.
And in terms of Operation Taller, was that something that was created specifically for the response to the pandemic, or was it something that was effectively an operation that's in place already? It just needed to be tweaked to respond to the specific requirements.
Operation Taller was put in place by NPCC in response to the pandemic. I'm not aware of it being in place before that, and we adopted the operation name, as so many other pieces that we adopted with it, as a response to the pandemic as a standalone, and it wasn't something that pre-existed at that time.
And I just want to talk about the structures within PSNI that formed in response to the pandemic. So you were the Gold Commander.
That's correct.
And the Gold Commander has strategic responsibility for, effectively in this case, the response to the pandemic. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
And
Well, actually, for the running of the organisation, And I know the inquiry understandably focuses on policing the pandemic, but actually my role as Gold Commander was about navigating the organisation through the pandemic. And actually, when we talk about our specific role in relation to the pandemic, which takes you into the world of regulations and enforcement, in the early stages, that was a very minor consideration for policing and for me as the Gold Commander. COBRA briefings through NPCC would have indicated working assumptions of absence in the workplace of between 35 and 40%. So the bigger strategic questions for me as a Gold Commander is, how do I continue to operate an effective police service to the communities across Northern Ireland with 40% absence, with a pandemic, with all the impacts? How do we create safe working spaces? How do we run contact management centres? How do we investigate crime? How do we make provision for victims of potentially rising domestic abuse? How do we provide those services? And if forced to make choices, where are those choices about service delivery going to be made? So those are actually, if you look at my to-do lists in the early days and weeks of the pandemic, strategically planning the organisation's path through that, milady, was as big, actually a far bigger concern because policing doesn't stop just because there's a pandemic. And how we continue to do that with the projected absences and pressures the organisation was likely to face, we're probably focusing most of my time. How we engage...
Sorry, Mr. Todd, is there any chance to speak just a little bit slower?
Sure.
And also keep your volume up a fraction as well, please.
So those were the big strategic items for us as a police service, and we would have reflected that into discussions around structures, responsibilities, and what else we could do to reasonably assist with the pandemic policing.
Thank you. I just want to focus on one aspect, a small aspect
Sure.
of that, I think you're saying, in terms of how the coronavirus regulations themselves were enforced and the approach using the 4Es, so all the stages prior to that. But again, I think it's fair to say that that's a part, but not the whole of your role.
Indeed.
And you had a silver commander who
Yes.
worked to you, who was responsible for implementing gold, in this case your strategy, and other decision making, is that right?
Yes.
And Silver Commander would have had a support team.
Yes.
And so the Silver Commander, together with the support team, were responsible for day-to-day work and operational decision making, is that
That's
right?
correct.
And obviously the Silver Commander was able to escalate things to you as the Gold Commander if that was thought necessary.
That's correct.
And on the 23rd of April 2020, it became part of the role of the Silver Commander to effectively pre-authorise any issuing of a fixed penalty notice. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to come back to the reason why that was deemed necessary. At the moment, just dealing with structures. But again, below Silver, there were a number of Bronze Commanders. Is that
Yes.
right? And they fed into the structure. One of the Bronze Commanders was responsible for, I think the words were, translating the regulations into operational instructions and guidance for officers.
That's correct.
How easy a role was that Bronze Commander, did that Bronze Commander find translating those regulations into operational instructions and guidance?
It was extremely difficult.
I'll come to some of the specifics in due course, but you say that the PSNI held a pandemic planning meeting on the 3rd of February 2020. What caused the PSNI to hold its first meeting on that date?
The 3rd of February 2020 predates my tenure as a Gold Commander. I took over slightly later than that. But it is fair to say we had been involved in a number of meetings through NPCC and others, and we were tracking how this was developing. And there were update meetings held at various times. I know other witnesses have talked about Operation Yellowhammer and the work that was going on around Brexit planning. And a lot of that work had sat in that space. But we were starting to sort of ask ourselves questions about how it might look going forward. So the early meetings in early February would have reflected that. I don't want to overstate it or understate it, but we certainly had a curiosity as to what the future looked like.
Can I just jump in there? Were these meetings driven by the PSNI, or were they driven by NPCC engaging with you?
I don't recall the specifics of the 3rd of February meeting. I'm sorry, I can't assist you with that.
But generally in those early stages, even if it's not necessarily the 3rd of February,
Sure.
are you able to remember whether this was an internal PSNI concern to the situation that was presenting itself in Northern Ireland in February 2020, or was this your national engagement was making PSNI believe this is something we're going to need to deal with?
To be fair, on balance, my lady, that was largely driven by what we were hearing from NPCC and national structures, and that was the impetus behind that.
Because you say that you appointed a tactical advisor who'd worked on the PSNI's influenza pandemic planning.
That's correct.
And what message, as far as you can remember, was that individual getting from those contacts he'd worked with as part of his pandemic planning? And when I say those individuals, those who were within the government of Northern Ireland.
I think we had lots of, I don't know that there were many clear messages. I think there were lots of questions. I think people were curious about the way it was developing. I think there were conversations that we had issues around SARS back in 2011, 2012. There were issues around avian flu. Some of which had a similar run-in, but had never really become the big issue that they might.
Were these questions from the PSNI, or were they questions being posed to the PSNI?
No, these were questions that were rising in our own mind about, frankly, where's this going?
And were you getting any answers from the government?
We were getting updates and the briefings that everybody else was getting, but there wasn't a clarity in that, and there were certainly no taskings or askings coming to the police service as a result.
Do you think that impeded the ability of the PSNI to respond to the pandemic in the early stages?
It's always better to have more time to plan, but I wouldn't be overly critical. I mean, looking back as late as late February, I was chairing a gold meeting in relation to the up-and-coming St. Patrick's Day celebrations, and it really hadn't occurred to anybody that wouldn't be going ahead on the 17th of March. And I think that captures maybe the mindset, my lady. However we ended up there, I wouldn't have been holding a gold meeting about St. Patrick's Day parades and celebrations on 21st, 22nd February 2020 in anticipation to be a lockdown a short number of weeks later.
But how does that quite square? That felt it necessary in early February to have the initial meetings. You've got the engagement with the NPCC, and England was ahead of Northern Ireland in terms of the development of the pandemic. How was it not occurring to people in late February when you're planning for the St. Patrick's Day parade that actually there might be an issue about how that was going to be policed, and also whether there was going to be any issues from the pandemic arising?
I can't account for that. I mean, we were getting briefings about how things were developing, what they might be, but people were still very much talking about containment phases, not only in Northern Ireland, but further afield. And I don't believe at that point people thought so much would happen so quickly.
You mentioned earlier on about the history of the PSNI. In those initial stages, so late March and earlier, were there any particular policing sensitivities that are unique to Northern Ireland, or which are more prevalent in Northern Ireland than they might be in the rest of the United Kingdom, that had any relevance or impact upon how the PSNI planned to respond to the pandemic?
I think there are lots of sensitivities for policing.
I was going to say, how much time do you have?
Well, that's right.
Political sensitivities or policing sensitivities?
But I would say this, my lady, I know time is pressing. I think Martin Hewitt, the chair of the NPCC, very articulately outlined the sensitivities for policing a pandemic in the UK, and we share that. And NPC's position on that is our position on it. It will not have been lost on my lady and other people in the room, the sensitivities and the politics, and how quickly issues in Northern Ireland become party political issues. That means they are in the public space, it means they're on radio shows, and it means that they are reflected in various members in our own policing board who would have different views on different subjects. And therefore, very quickly, that political interest becomes input for policing and its considerations. So that sensitivity is as per the rest of the UK, but I think in a small place like this, and other witnesses have talked about how close politics are to communities and how close policing is to communities. I think it would be understood in the room that there are sensitivities in Northern Ireland that perhaps are more sharply defined on top of what the rest of the UK also experienced.
If I can have on the screen, please, INQ 000 291 261. So this is a note of a meeting. It's not the PSNI's note, but it's a note of the meeting of the 20th of March 2020. So this is prior to lockdown, but after the NICMA arrangements had been stood up. And this is a note of a meeting between the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, Chief Constable and the Deputy Chief Constable. You can see the points that are discussed there about observations about command and control, about getting good issues, and then at the bottom, importance of personal resilience. It doesn't seem from that meeting, and again, I appreciate this as Chief Constable to the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, it doesn't seem like there's great clarity about the precise role that the PSNI was going to play in the response to the pandemic as of the 20th of March. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
In terms of your understanding of the role that the PSNI was going to play as of the 20th of March, do you think that there was sufficient clarity at that time?
No.
And why was that?
I think a range of agencies were playing a significant amount of catch-up. I don't pretend to be any different than anybody else. I think the implications for policing started to crystallise for me when I saw the Italian police patrolling the streets of Italian towns not long before the meeting that's just been on so that was 9, 10, 11 of April, and you had Italian police patrolling Italian towns, getting people to stay in their homes. And it was at that point I thought, started
11 April or March?
Oh, sorry, March, beg your pardon. In the Italian lockdown. And I suppose it was at that point that it started to crystallise in my mind what sort of ask might be coming. But I also tempered that with the Italian police and the Italian systems different to ours, and the ask here might be differently done. But still at that point, and I think some of the frustration that the Chief Constable had, and as illustrated by the report, was we were starting to have meetings in a number of fronts with a number of groups. And there was lots of information sharing, and there's lots of discussion, but there was no ask of policing or a framework arising as to what the ask might look like.
So was there no planning, realistically?
Realistically not.
Because you said about the 9th, 10th, 11th of March. I mean, you set the gold objectives on the 9th of March.
Yes.
You had your first gold command meeting on the 12th of March.
And that was the date on which I was appointed.
Yes. Is it fair to say that effectively your concerns around that 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th of March led to the initiation of the gold structure?
Well, the Chief Constable appointed me as the gold commander. It was a change because we hitherto, my lady, we had, I think for good reason, another one of my Assistant Chief Constable colleagues had been working on the Brexit planning through Operation Yellowhammer. The structures and relationships were being developed that way.
Excuse me, Mr. Todd. Is there any chance you could slow down again, please?
Sorry, beg your pardon. I think at that point, my colleague was seen as the right conduit with the relationships and the structures, that this would sort of move from one plan into another. But as we started to see the potential for the operational ask starting to arise with the experience in continental Europe, it was felt that it would have a much more day-to-day operational focus required, and to split that away from myself, who was in charge of local policing, I think the Chief Constable took the view that that wasn't a good structure and therefore appointed me as the gold commander.
So as of the 23rd of March, when the country went into lockdown, again, do you think that the structures were in place to enable a proper and effective response in Northern Ireland, from your perspective as a police officer?
I think from a policing perspective, as one thing policing tends to be very good at, my lady, is doing lots of things quickly and putting their best foot forward. But it wasn't an ideal situation.
But in terms of doing things quickly and putting your best foot forward, that's exactly what you need at a time when you're trying to respond.
And that's exactly what we did. And in fairness to the men and women under my command, everybody put their best effort to this. And actually, the amount of distance the organisation travelled in a very short time, we never missed an emergency call. We never missed a call for service at any point throughout the pandemic, as well as all the other stuff we delivered on top. And I think that's a credit to the men and women of the police services.
Do you think the other limbs of the Northern Ireland government progressed as quickly or as ready as you were?
I think different limbs of government were in different places at different times.
So by the time of the 23rd of March, do you, again from your perspective, consider that there was sufficient level of readiness to respond?
No, I don't.
In what way was it deficient?
From a policing and operational perspective, as an example, the date of lockdown was announced at really short notice. And whilst the concept was announced, the regulations that would shape it weren't available. We've talked about, Milady, the 3 E's and the 4 E's. But the simple truth is that for the first 3 weeks of the first lockdown, there was no 4th E. And this is just a preparedness issue. For no reason other than that's the way it was. Fixed penalty notices. The only agency in Northern Ireland who has a contract to have them printed was the police service. They're printed in Wales, and the lead time for introduction, that was 3 weeks. You couldn't physically get fixed penalty notices, which was the principal enforcement limb. Physically couldn't put them in place for 3 weeks.
Yes, that's a practical issue, but isn't there also a principled issue that you can't enforce what you don't have?
Well, that's correct. So, at the very early stages, regulations were provided at very short notice. They came without guidance. They were secondary legislation to primary legislation. They were regulations. There were no powers of arrest. There had seemed to be little consideration given to giving police officers powers to ask members of the public questions about why they're out of their home or where they're going to work. You can ask, but there's no authority to do so if people were difficult or wanted to game the system. There was no guidance which would have shown due regard to European Convention considerations. There was no guidance to point the police in terms of Section 75 Northern Ireland Act considerations. That was all sitting. None of that was available at the time that lockdown went live, and that places police in a difficult position, where your natural and professional inclination is for the service to do the maximum amount it can to assist the health service and protect people's lives, understanding that the foundations on which you've been asked to do some of this work in our normal understanding of the law were not in place as they might otherwise have been.
And whose obligation do you consider it was to make sure that was in place?
It's a collective of government, but at the end of the day, I take the view, others may argue, but I took the view that a pandemic was a particular set of circumstances, not normal policing circumstances. This was a health crisis. We were being asked to take steps to protect the health service and to protect the community's health. And the responsibility for shaping what that looked like by way of guidance and or regulations or law was a matter for the directing body, which would have been, in my view, the Department of Health and or the executive, depending on which way government decided to split that responsibility.
It might be thought that when regulations are brought in order to respond to a public health crisis, that those initial stages are when it's almost most important to have clear and effective understanding about how those regulations are going to be applied and potentially enforced. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
In those initial stages, when they were brought in on the 28th of March, did the PSNI, putting it simply, understand what they were being asked to do by those regulations?
I think we understood the framework, we understood the concept of a lockdown, and we understood how policing could assist in that space. Did we understand the detail? It wasn't provided. Did we understand the guidance that we should rely upon in operating it? It wasn't available. And actually, there was a reluctance to provide that. It did not come in a short time frame after that. We had to push very hard to get that, and you'll see that reflected in correspondence from the Chief Constable to the Health Minister.
Yes, that correspondence was the 17th of April. Are you suggesting that, let's put it a different way, even by the 17th of April, you didn't have the tools that you needed to properly police those regulations?
Well, I drafted some of that correspondence for the Chief Constable in relation to what I felt, again, it was my professional view, what I felt was a lack of progress on what I considered to be important issues.
Can we see that letter? That's INQ 000 272745. Thank you. And this is a relatively lengthy letter. I think it's 4 pages, something along those lines. What had it taken? Let me ask that a slightly different way. It was a slightly surprising step, would you agree, for a Chief Constable to need to write to the Health Minister to say, effectively, we're not being given what we need to enforce these regulations. Do you agree with that?
I think it's a significant step. We're a very busy organisation, and it was after a conversation between I and the Chief Constable at the time, deciding the best way to try and approach this.
And was this the culmination of a number of, let's say, lower level efforts, maybe engaging with departments, dealing at a slightly lower level rather than Chief Constable to Minister?
Yes, it was, and I don't attach any personal blame to any of those parties, my lady. It was quite clear that Department of Health lawyers were under-resourced, badly stretched, and were doing the best that they could. I was acutely aware that what I was asking was a further imposition upon that. In its own way, it was a way of raising us at what we believed to be an appropriate strategic level.
Okay. So if we can...
It is also worth saying that it is in response to a feeling, a concern that I had and the Chief Constable had, that the police service were becoming the first point of contact and the lightning rod, for want of a better phrase, in everything that people wanted to know or were unhappy about the regulations. The number of media interviews I was being asked to do to explain regulations that I didn't write and outline guidance, which I wasn't given, we felt was becoming an increasing risk for us as a police service and was symptomatic of the conversation we had earlier.
Well, if I can just pause you there, if we can just scroll down on this letter, please. And we can see at 1 that there's a request for a formal commissioning arrangement. But if we... I'm just trying to find... There's one section there where I believe the Chief Constable talks about this being a... There, there's that just above paragraph 3 there. I'm advised that exchanges with Solace. I appreciate this being kept under review. The risk of policing fulfilling responsibilities outside our traditional role have medium-term consequences for public confidence. When you were saying that you were becoming a lightning rod, do you think that there were concerns amongst yourself and or the Chief Constable about the general confidence of the population of Northern Ireland and the PSNI at that time?
I think it's fair to say that we had concerns that if we didn't take action, that was a potential consequence for us.
Do you think that this letter effectively headed off those concerns, or did it not?
I think it helped progress matters, but this is why, again, I'm genuinely not. We had a very healthy working relationship with Department of Health staff, and on a personal basis, I felt tremendously supported from the Chief Medical Officer, and I hope he felt likewise in the work we were able to do in support of the overall effort. But the nature of regulations changing so quickly, and always being, we sort of never really felt that you were getting, regulations would change very quickly. Sometimes what was trailed wasn't what was published. It wasn't just that the regulations came out, that we had some concerns, that they were addressed, and everything was fine, because it was more iterative or cyclical. The problems arose every time we went round the circle, and that was pressure of time, pressure of politics, pressure of changing circumstances.
Well, let's look at this from a slightly different perspective. One of the essential elements of the inquiry is to make recommendations about how systems can manufacture or can work better in future in the event of another pandemic. Given what you're saying about the circumstances that have led you to this point, what recommendations would you think that Milady should consider about how the relationship between the police, government departments in Northern Ireland, regulations, what recommendations would you consider should be thought of? I don't mean to put you on the spot in that. But
and yet, Milady, policing likes to operate on the basis of no surprises. We like to deal with our community on the basis of no surprises. We find that people respond to policing best when there's time to explain, understand, move forward together. Unfortunately, a pandemic was full of surprises, and that, to some degree, points to a lack of preparedness and a lack of planning. Yes, there was a flu pandemic plan, but actually, when you looked at it, it wasn't helpful actually, in terms of its applicability to the COVID pandemic. I sat for a number of years as an assistant chief constable on various contingency planning structures across government, and whilst a pandemic may have been the UK's #1 critical incident risk, I never heard it mentioned. Certainly the here and now of critical incident planning in Northern Ireland tended to be around weather emergencies, flooding, heavy snowfall, and climate change related, because that was happening regularly and we were being called to action on that regularly. So to arrive at a pandemic facing a very short number of days, actually, never mind weeks, with no framework, of no concept of what a lockdown would look like, of who would be responsible for what, of who would coordinate that. You know, policing were invited under some of the civil contingency arrangements to take up the chair of the strategic coordinating group, because it was seen to be related to a pandemic, which was seen to be related to a mass casualty event. And I said, I'm sorry, but I don't know what police would be coordinating here. It's not a multiple accident on a motorway with mass casualties or something of that ilk, or an arena disaster or a terrorist attack, which is a traditional fare for contingency planning. We just hadn't entered this space, and therefore we were in the world of surprises, and that's difficult for policing and communities.
Because the police, you can't police your way out of a pandemic.
Absolutely not.
So you needed effectively the other parts of the cross-governmental response to be doing their job to enable you to do yours.
But even, and some of your paper reflects, trying to get others to play a space in the enforcement space, and, you know, local councils, trading standards, you know, people were actively suggesting that health and safety workplace arrangements would be inspected by the police service, because we, in the initial regulations, we were the only body designated under the regulations. And from day one, I was saying, this is on top of the police service we provide. And if you're going to be effective at enforcement, people talk about enforcement.
You're a fraction ahead of me here, Mr.
Sure.
Todd. I'm going to come back to the other bodies in enforcement.
It illustrates the point that thinking, it was very much set on the police's table, and, you know, because we're a can-do organisation and these were important times when people were dying, we did our best, but there were some things that made that harder than it should have been. Because,
again, coming back to the letter that's still on the screen from the Chief Constable, again, this is dated the 17th of February. We can see in the top paragraph, this is about an operational commission against which the parameters of policing response can be tested, provide the necessary legitimacy to what we're being asked to achieve. And then the next paragraph down, there's talk about considerations designating other public officials as enforcement bodies. Again, at the bottom, in terms of paragraph 3, you can see there's third line up from the bottom, there's talk about risks further confusing public understanding of how the regulations are being enforced, effectively, the PSNI were flagging up, even by the 17th of April, all the concerns which realistically perpetuated throughout the lifetime of the pandemic. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then if we can just look at the response from the Department of Health, and this is at INQ 000 303 261. And we can see that's dated the 21st of April 2020. I presume you're very familiar with the content of this letter.
I am.
Do you consider that this response actually addressed the concerns that the PSNI were raising in that previous letter?
No, I don't.
Why not?
I think it acknowledges the problems but doesn't provide the solutions which we were trying to outline.
If we can go over the page to page 2, please. And then it's the large paragraph in the middle where there's talk about, I note your request, a formal commissioning arrangement be established. What benefit would a commissioning arrangement have given the PSNI by the middle of April?
I think there was an emerging narrative. I don't think we should expect a number of people in the population to welcome lockdown as a concept or regulations. And it seemed to policing and others across government that from the first days of lockdown and restrictions that people sought to game, my phrase, to find a way around the restrictions and find a way around the regulations. And it was a police perspective on that a lot of the queries that arose about what was or wasn't permissible was for the police to decide. And I'd fundamentally disagreed with that. I thought it was for health to decide what they did or didn't want to happen across communities to protect their health service and protect the lives of the people they were treating, and that we would operationalise that for them as commissioned by it. They were the people with the...
I'd just like to slow down again.
I took the view then, as I take the view now, that the executive and or the health department, whoever takes the view on that, that they are making a collective decision on what they want to happen in terms of managing the pandemic. And the tasking to policing is to operationalise that. And I think for relationships with communities and answering for the outworking of that, whilst there's an operational independence about how we do it, the what and the regulations, it shouldn't be for the Assistant Chief Constable to be writing operational guidance to try and guide people to give us back the guidance that we think would work. And that commissioning for me was, if you look at a task and coordination structure, who has the strategic intent, who has the strategic objectives, and who has the data to drive that. The police service weren't any of those three people, and therefore the people in that position, be that the Department of Health or the Executive Office or a partnership in there, should be collectively taking a view on what they want happening on the streets, roads and byways of Northern Ireland and the borders and anywhere else, and then saying to the police, here's what we need from you and here's the regulations and guidance to support you. And I don't think we ever got there.
Do you think that would also have helped public confidence for that to have been in place?
I think it would have made for a better no surprises approach, because it leaves the police, in the absence of those things, it leaves the police service open to the allegations that we're being heavy-handed or acting beyond our remit in a novel and contentious space, and none of those things are good for public confidence in policing.
Did you ever get a commissioning arrangement?
The closest we came to a commissioning arrangement, milady, were when we considered local restrictions. You could see
in September.
Yeah, you could see some of that thinking in the run into the second wave and the second batch of restrictions. You could see that thinking arising. But no, we never got to a formal commissioning arrangement would be the full answer.
And did that have a negative impact upon the PSNI's ability to police the pandemic and or the public confidence?
I'm reluctant to say it inhibited our ability to respond. It made the consequences more difficult to deal with. You were doing more explaining than might otherwise have to be the case. And again, it was largely left in the police's space to explain that. and we just, it would be my view then, and my colleagues, as it is now, I think that was unfortunate.
Coming back to other bodies enforcing, if we can have, please, INQ 000 390980, and it'd be page 19. This is a briefing provided by the Health Minister to his executive colleagues dated the 14th of May 2020. And you can see the heading is under consideration about proposal to designate district councils as enforcement bodies. And we can see at the top there that even by 14th of May, it was the PSNI and the Harbour Police who were enforcing the restrictions. I don't want to be unfair. You probably weren't getting a huge amount of support from the Harbour Police in enforcing restrictions?
Harbour Police is a small organisation with a very small geographical remit. So in the scheme of Northern Ireland, no disrespect to Harbour Police, no, my lady.
And so in comparison, in England, Scotland and Wales, as paragraph 2 says, that local authorities had been designated for enforcement of certain parts of the regulations. Were you looking for other bodies? Well, firstly, you were looking for other bodies to be able to provide enforcement, is that right?
I think trying to take a strategic view on it, my lady, looking forward, it was clear that, even by that stage, that restrictions would relax, but they would stay in some shape, size or form. It was also clear that those restrictions may need to be flexed over time, and similar issues would be revisited over time. And it was not, whilst this was a starting point, I took the view, forgive me for a slightly long answer to this. In the early part of lockdown 1, the police were in a fortunate position. Day-to-day demand, the evening economy didn't require policing because there wasn't one. Road traffic almost disappeared. And thankfully, mercifully, the high 40% working assumption absence rates in policing weren't realised. So we had a significant amount of operational capability, which I was able to deploy in support of the health protection regulations enforcement. But looking forward, as we knew shops would reopen, evening economy would reopen, more people would go back to work, more of the normal policing demand would increase, and therefore over time the only way of effectively managing restrictions was to have the widest possible involvement of partners. And I would have been working with major retailers about how they would effectively small P police supermarkets, with local councils, with trading standards, with business owners, because in my view it was foreseeable over time that the only way of getting that wider effort in support of those regulations wasn't for police to step back. We just continued. There was going to be more demand at a time when we had less supply, and therefore the bigger partnership was a more likely successful approach.
If we could just scroll down to paragraphs 5 and 6, please. And we can see there paragraph 5. I think that effectively encapsulates what you were just saying there, that as things begin to reopen, it's going to become harder to enforce.
Indeed.
And we can see at paragraph 6 there, the Health and Safety Executive position, there's no need to designate HSCNI to enforce the restriction regulations. Did you get a sense from other bodies in the broadest sense who have enforcement powers that there was any willingness from those bodies to actually play any enforcement role throughout the pandemic?
I think there was a limited willingness. I think they saw that was them putting themselves and their staff into potentially confrontational situations which they didn't feel equipped to deal with. And I understand that concern, my lady. But I was flagging to government that nevertheless, we either widened our capability across agencies, or we were going to end up with a gap because policing couldn't fill it all. I think this was true of things like public transport and all of those things. And there were lots of debates about why public transport could police tickets but not face masks. And all those sorts of things were being debated behind the scenes. Policing just felt that there wasn't a long queue of people queuing up to help in that wider effort, milady.
Thank you. So were there learnings from wave 1 through into wave 2 about how you policed the pandemic?
I think we...
Thank you.
Yes, in terms of preparedness and that no surprises, but it was cyclical, because when the second batch of restrictions in the second wave came into effect, the regulations were very different. There were lots more exemptions, and the more exemptions you have in those types of restrictions, the more likely people are to exploit it around the edges. And
well, are they also less likely to be able to understand what they can and cannot do?
I think they're less likely to... Yes, I think there are people who are less likely to understand it, and I think there are people who are more likely to use that confusion to circumvent the regulations. I think that's true.
Was it also the fact that you were moving from a spring-summer into an autumn-winter setting? Did that change how you were able to police the restrictions that have been brought in?
I don't think it was... I think the risks increased because of people moving from the outdoors to the indoors. Policing of it, I think the nature of the regulations changed, therefore the nature of the policing changed. But the bigger aspect for policing was, as business and economies opened up, so did demand for policing, to do non-pandemic policing. And we started to be stretched in some places.
The inquiry has seen throughout autumn a number of documents coming from the CMO, the CSA. People have been talking about particular areas of concern, whether it be house parties or amongst different age groups. Were you being told by the Department of Health or anybody else where any particular areas of concern were as the pandemic progressed? Because would that have helped you to then target your response?
So we had access to the Department of Health dashboards. I had regular briefings from the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor, and my people did from public health officials as well. So we had information about what the issues were, and we knew those issues, and house parties did feature. And it was a particular point. It was a particular point of effort on behalf of the police service, milady. From recollection, I briefed. I mean, you mentioned the Northern Ireland Policing Board are part of my accountability, or were part of my accountability arrangements, and I briefed the Policing Board as to police action around coronavirus regulations, and I pointed out, so the figures, even in September of 2020, coming through the summer, we had issued heading towards 500 fines for people in house parties. We had issued somewhere above 60 prohibition notices on individual private premises. We had visited more than 1,000 pub inspections as the licensed trade reopened, and issued prohibition notices in relation to over 60 pubs and closing them down whilst they resolved the issues they needed to resolve, and as well as thousands of visits supporting the retail sector with their work as well. So, I was regularly reporting the enforcement efforts of policing through the accountability body that was the Policing Board, and indeed other interested parties, and we were aligning that on a daily basis. It wasn't touched on, but part of our silver structure, milady, with a 24-hour command room running throughout the pandemic, and day, by 24-hour period, I knew as the Gold Commander where we had been and how many of each of the 4 E's we had used over time. That data has been made available to the inquiry. It was substantial, more than substantial, huge amount of work put in. And contrary to some evidence, I was pushing the executive in debates around this about the appropriateness of £60 fines, which were £30 if you paid them soon, which I pointed out to executive policy-making colleagues is less than you would get for dropping litter in Belfast city centre, and whether that demonstrated the seriousness with which we took a breach of the coronavirus regulations. And anecdotes make wonderful telling, but police officers attended a house party in a rural community at around this time. It was a 21st birthday party. There were 30 plus people. Blatant breach of the regulations, and the householder decided they were quite happy to pay the £1,000 fine as a householder and £60, £30 for each of the attendees as a price of having the party. And I don't, and the police, at that point of issuing those fines, the police had no further powers in relation to it, and no further deterrent in relation to it. And I don't think that sort of event, which obviously becomes public knowledge, helps a police service or a government manage a health pandemic.
Just want to deal with two further topics, and that's in relation to policing large-scale events. Now, Mr. Todd, it's been throughout the Modules 2C, it's not been the intention to look at the rights and wrongs of what happened on the day of Bobby Story's funeral, but it is about looking at the impact of that event. What is your view on the impact upon compliance with the regulations of the Bobby Story funeral?
I know you haven't sought to draw me, my lady, but I think it's important, if not on a personal basis, on behalf of policing and the men and women who police in Northern Ireland. What happened on the day of Bobby Story's funeral was wrong. I said so at the time. I said throughout the various investigations into it, and I said it every day since. I think people who are involved in that have now come to that position.
Sorry, Mr. Todd, again, if you could just slow your pace down, please.
I think people who have been involved in that have now come to that position, but that was the police position before, during and after. I think it was wrong. I don't think it should have happened for either the politicians or the people present. Neither do I believe that there was a policing solution to that.
Why was there no policing solution?
I don't believe it was a policing solution, and I don't think any of the reports into it have identified one.
I think we may be straying off.
I was about.
What? No, well, let me take it in. Let me take it into
slightly different way.
Let me take it into more thematic space for you, Chair, if that helps.
But it's just that I can't investigate whether or
Sure.
not the police should have done more arresting
Indeed.
people. That's not part of my job.
Sure.
I think. Can we go back to Mr. Scott's question?
But I think
Yes.
in the
Mr.
question,
Todd, I may be able to help you just
Yes.
in terms of the question I'm seeking to ask. Does there become effectively a critical mass of people when you have a large gathering beyond which it effectively becomes almost impossible for you to provide a policing response? Whatever the setting?
theoretically, I think the bigger issue in relation to this, and going back to the previous conversation, was when you're relying on secondary legislation, low-level, in legal terms, low-level regulations, that the top of their fine scale is a fixed penalty notice, where there are no powers of arrest and no powers of physical restriction, which don't come with guidance which is based on the European Convention of Human Rights and the right to protest and all the rights of private life and all those other rights that we enshrine in our decision-making. When that is absent from the regulations handed to the police service can step in and make decisions, but it's not a good space to be in. And the notion that you would start to deploy large numbers of police with the potential for disorder and the requirement to exercise the use of force just becomes untenable. Untenable generally, and particularly untenable with the human rights considerations of that, and the guidance hasn't been issued as part of the regulations, my lady.
I think we are going down whether the police, and that's not part of my remit.
I was moving on, my lady.
So can we go back to the question that Mr. Scott asked about the Story funeral, Mr. Todd, the impact on compliance?
The police service took a lot of criticism. It made life difficult, very difficult for my officers. I think I didn't see any significant shift in the data, my lady. It shifted the tone, and I think that emerging number of people who were seeking a reason not to comply or adhere to the regulations had their case strengthened.
So the criticism was of the police for not stepping in, and you've just given some of the reasons why they couldn't. But that criticism led to people thinking, well, if the police don't even do that, then...
Well, I think the event undermined confidence in the very people who are making the regulations, and that was never going to make it easier for the body charged with enforcing them.
If I can just move on finally to the issue of qualities. To what extent were the PSNI giving consideration to vulnerable groups about how they were involved in the coronavirus regulations?
I've already pointed out that I thought that Section 75 screening and the outcomes of which incorporating into guidance attached to the regulations is an omission. We sought, as a service, I sought as a Gold Commander to fill that gap in the operational guidance I gave to the officers, and specifically the operational guidance I gave to the 24-hour cell that controlled policing operations. I think there are a number of documents that you will see that I have written to officers with letters that I had received from members of the public, maybe circumstances we hadn't foreseen, but we used those case studies and we used those messages to encourage discretion, to recognise vulnerability, to acknowledge it, and act and exercise our professional discretion in relation to it. And I take the view that as a police service we had that at the forefront of our minds, not only in a policy space but in a practice and operational space, and I think we were really strong in delivering against that. And I think it's to the credit of the system we set up and the daily scrutiny we gave to the impacts of our enforcement, and that methodology allowed us to make these considerations on a day-by-day basis across Northern Ireland with a view to fairness and equality and discretion, and to make sure that what could otherwise be a blunt tool was used as professionally as possible in the circumstances. And I think the organisation deserves some credit for that.
Minetti, I have no further questions.
Can I go back, Mr. Todd, to the regulations themselves? You may know that in Module 2, I asked Mr. Hewitt about the regulations themselves. Now, I appreciate the pressure people were under drafting these regulations in very difficult circumstances, but I couldn't understand them, and that has a number of problems with that. So basically, there's a principle, as you all understand, of the criminal justice system that you shouldn't have penal consequences unless the person who's committing the offence understands it. It's difficult for your officers to enforce. And as you said, I think the second lot of regulations, you said they have masses of exemptions, which brings a lot of subjectivity into them. Were your regulations here in Northern Ireland as bad as I think they were in England?
I wouldn't argue with either your or Martin Hewitt's assessment, milady. I think we had the additional factor that they were often amended, but the amendments were rarely consolidated, and therefore you were reading a new set of regulations, trying to remember what it said 6 regulations ago and 2 amendments in the middle. And you asked me the question earlier about the role of my bronze commander, the chief inspector, who dealt with that. It was a very, very difficult role. And
how does the officer on the street deal with it?
Well, that was a challenge that officer on my behalf and the team on my behalf, it was one of the big parts of our job was taking that and condensing into 1 and 2 pages of guidance, the practical pillars that we used, and condensing that into practical, usable advice and guidance, and then supervising that through the 24-hour command and control system that we had. Again, I think that was successful, but it was very, very difficult work.
Did you get more notice than Mr. Hewitt said the National Police Chiefs Council got?
I don't recall his part of that evidence.
Basically, I think he said sometimes, and Mr. Phillips could confirm, he said that basically the regulations would change at a minute past midnight, and they'd be told at 5 to midnight if they were lucky. Sometimes afterwards, so Mr. Phillips. I think
that did happen, my lady. Yes.
That did happen.
That did happen.
Right. Thank you very much for your help, Mr. Todd. I'm very grateful. Right. 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Yes.
For the final witness, and then closing submissions. Thank you.